Political Science 100. It's time to talk about the courts, the last of the institutions of government we're going to address. So this is the judicial branch of our government. And I want to start with an analogy. Imagine that when we're selecting officials to referee a football game, we follow the following process. We take attendance and we count the number of fans there for each team. And the team that has the most fans, that team's coach gets to pick the officials. What do you suppose could go wrong? Do you suppose that coach would pick fair and neutral referees, or do you think there might be a tendency on the part of that coach to pick officials that perhaps would see things his or her way? Well, what could go wrong is something like this. This is a football game some years ago between San Diego State and the Red Helmets and BYU and the White. And this is an image from a BYU football player, a running back, and he's in the process of being tackled. But as you can see, his knee is not down, so he's not tackled, but he doesn't have the ball. He's fumbled. The ball's loose. On this play, San Diego State recovered the ball, and so it should have been their ball. But because the play was close, the officials went to instant replay. They wanted to review it. So the play was under review, and after the review, it was decided that BYU should keep the ball, that there hadn't been a fumble. BYU went on to score on that drive and won the game against San Diego State by less than a touchdown. How in the world did the replay officials mess up that call so badly when it's so evident that the ball carrier fumbled? Well, they never saw the image that you're seeing right now. This picture, which clearly shows a fumble, was never fed into the cameras that were being reviewed by the officials on the field. And it turns out, upon investigation, that the replay officials up in the booth who controlled what was shown to the referees on the field never showed them this. Both of those officials were in the employment of BYU. One was an alum working and then one was actually employed in the athletics department. That's what could go wrong if you have blatantly biased officials making decisions. Which brings me to an interesting question, I think. Here are some of the issues that have recently been or are currently on or are very likely to soon arrive at the docket of the United States Supreme Court. Abortion, same-sex marriage, climate change, gun rights, affirmative action, voter ID requirements, gerrymandering, election campaign contributions, housing discrimination, prayer in legislatures. These are the most controversial issues in American politics. And it raises a question of whether or not there is a fundamental contradiction in our democracy. Why does the least democratic, unelected institution in our political system have what really amounts to the final say in deciding the most controversial issues in our politics? The main things that we're going to look at in this discussion, and they follow more or less the flow of the chapter, the text chapter, is first the origins and the structure of the federal judiciary. And then in this video, we're going to get as far as how the power of judicial review, which is the fundamental power that the courts have, how that was acquired. I'm going to take a break there, and then we'll pick up and talk about the three broad eras of judicial review, the three big thematic areas over the court's history in which it has exercised judicial review. We'll talk about judicial decision making, and we'll talk about the courts and separation of powers. So, the judicial branch of our government is laid out in Article 3 of the Constitution, and it's very short. We're going to read most of it in the next couple of slides. Article 3 says that the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The judges, both of the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior. So what the Constitution says there is it specifies there must be a Supreme Court, and then whatever other courts are to be established, it's really left up to Congress. So the Constitution doesn't say anything other than there'll be a Supreme Court and then some other courts, and Congress can figure out what that's going to be. And also it stipulates the tenure of judges. They hold their offices during good behavior. In other words, they have life appointments. They do not have to be reappointed. They're not elected in the first place. They do not have to seek reappointment. Once appointed, they stay in office unless they really screw up. Article 3 then goes on to say, in all cases affecting ambassadors and other public ministers and consuls, and those in which a state shall be a party, the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction. In all other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction. So here it is. Here the Constitution is saying that normally the Supreme Court that was mentioned that we have to have, normally it's going to have appellate jurisdiction. That means that it will normally hear cases on appeal. It will not hear cases for their first hearing. That's called original jurisdiction. But it does specify a couple of instances in which the Supreme Court does have original jurisdiction. Cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls. It's basically foreign entities that are somehow caught up in a dispute in our federal courts. And those in which a state shall be a party. So if Colorado and California were fighting over water rights over the Colorado River, for example, which we are, if that were to go to the court system, it would go to the Supreme Court originally first. So to reiterate, a couple of points about the structure of the court that the Constitution mandates. We will have a Supreme Court, and then whatever lower courts Congress it decides upon later, and it specifies the jurisdiction of those courts. And there really are two kinds of jurisdiction, original and appellate. Original meaning it refers to the first hearing of a case, its original hearing, and appellate means a hearing of a dispute of that case, an appeal of that case. Almost always the Supreme Court has appellate jurisdiction. In the vast majority of court cases, they start at the lower levels and are appealed up to the Supreme Court. But in a few cases, disputes between states and cases involving foreign ministers, then and only then, and I'm beating this point to death for a reason, you'll see it later, then and only then the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction. Okay, so that's what the Constitution says, and it left it up to Congress to basically lay out the rest of the structure of the courts, and in 1789, that's what Congress did. Congress passed a law called the Judiciary Act of 1789, and this is right after the establishment of the nation. This was in the first administration, the Washington administration. Congress created a three-tiered court system. The first tier is the federal district courts, and those are the federal courts that have original jurisdiction. When you bring a case in federal court, you go to the district court to start off with. Another point that I want to mention here, another term, is the discretion that the courts have. Discretion means whether they have the right to decide not to take your case. The federal district court has no discretion. If a case is brought before the court, it must be heard. Right now, there are about 95 courts scattered throughout the United States with a little under 700 judges serving in those courts. The second level is the Circuit Court of Appeals, often just called the circuit courts. And the circuit courts have appellate jurisdiction and no discretion. So the circuit courts only hear appeals of cases decided previously in the federal district courts. Typically, the loser of those decisions is unhappy and wants to appeal. So that when they appeal, that appeal would be heard in the circuit courts. The circuit courts likewise have no discretion. If an appeal is brought to them, they have to hear it. Right now, there are 12 circuit courts with about 179 judges serving in them. The text has a map of where those circuit courts are. As you can see, they cover multiple states. And there are things that we know about these circuit courts, and this is sort of hinting at where this conversation is going to go in the second part. The Ninth Circuit Court, for example, is known as being more liberal than the Fifth Circuit Court down here in the South, or the 11th Circuit Court in the Southeast. And that's partly a reflection of the polarized political environment we're in, wherein when judges are appointed to the courts, there's a practice called senatorial courtesy, where the home state senator of that judge is asked whether or not he or she is on board with this person being appointed to a federal judgeship. And increasingly, the decision, yes or no on that question, is driven more and more by ideology and whether the nominee for the judicial position, whether their judicial philosophy seems conservative or liberal enough to satisfy the home state senators who are being asked. So we'll come back to political ideology and judicial appointments towards the end of this. There's another clause that's part of this same law that Congress passed in 1789, the Judiciary Act, and it says that the Supreme Court may issue a writ of mandamus, sometimes pronounced mandamus. A writ of mandamus is a written order directing someone to do something. So again, remember that as part of this act that Congress passed in 1789 that first created the three-tiered court structure with district courts, circuit courts, and obviously the Supreme Court. And then in that law that Congress passed, they gave the court the power to issue a writ of mandamus, to order someone to do something, because that's going to become an important point as we tell the story later on. Okay, so going into one of our earliest presidential elections, which was the election of 1800, the role and the power of the federal courts was a huge issue in that election. This was a very contentious time in American politics. It rivaled what we're experiencing today, where there were two basically warring tribes, and the tribes, instead of Democrats or Republicans, at that time they were called the Federalists on one side and the Democratic Republicans on the other side. And the Federalists were one of the first political parties. They were the party of George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and then John Adams. And incumbent President John Adams was seeking re-election. And the Federalists, as their name suggests, favored a strong federal government, including a strong federal court system. They favored more expansive powers of the judicial branch. The Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, which was the party opposing the Federalists, and the Democratic Republicans' presidential nominee was Thomas Jefferson, they favored states' rights more than the federal government, and they wanted weaker courts. They wanted more power for elected representatives as opposed to the courts, and they wanted more power to remain with the states as opposed to the federal government. And again, that might not sound like that riveting of an issue, but these two camps hated each other. The rivalry here, and it had really grown, but it was really as much between Thomas Jefferson seeking the presidency and Alexander Hamilton, who had been a Federalist, who was really the leading member of the Federalists with President Washington no longer in office. Alexander Hamilton was the power among the Federalist Party. The personal and professional animosity between these folks was extreme. It's not unlike what we see between today's Republicans and Democrats. So, and this was the issue they were fighting about, because the power of the courts had not really yet been decided. The country was new. The branches of government, the institutions of government, were kind of feeling their way in their roles. And so what the courts were going to do, especially how much power, how expansive the power of the federal court would be, was up in the air. So that was the issue, and Jefferson won, which you'd think would be bad news for the Federalists and their hopes for a stronger federal court system. But outgoing President John Adams and his Secretary of State, a guy named John Marshall, had a plan. And their plan was to protect the federal courts against the incoming Jefferson administration. And this plan and its flawed execution set the stage for one of the most pivotal early court cases in our country's history. And that case is Marbury versus Madison, which was decided in 1803. Here was the plan. It basically amounted to court packing. President Adams and his Secretary of State, John Marshall, decided that they would increase the number of judicial positions in the federal courts, first off. So they expanded the size of the federal courts. Secondly, they and the Federalist majority in Congress, in the Senate, appointed Federalists, like-minded people, such as themselves, to those positions, including a guy named John Marshall as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Yes, the same John Marshall who was the Secretary of State under the Adams administration. Part of this plan was to move him over to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So what they were basically trying to do was insulate the court against the influence of Jefferson's attempt to weaken the courts. Because remember, judicial appointments are for good behavior, meaning life terms. So if they expanded the size of the federal judiciary, put a bunch of Federalists in those new positions, so you would then have a court system that was full of Federalists, people who wanted a stronger federal court and more powerful national government. You would have a majority, a dominant body of those folks in the judiciary, and Jefferson really couldn't do anything about that. And included, again, as part of that plan, was the installation of John Marshall as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So that's what they did. The time frame is important here. So the election of 1800 was held in November, as our presidential elections are. But the new president, President Thomas Jefferson, doesn't take office until January of 1801. So there's a couple months in there, and it was during those couple of months where this plan was carried out. Carrying out the plan involves the president first Congress approving the expansion of the judicial branch, the president nominating people to fill these new judicial appointments, the Senate confirming those appointments, and then the delivery of a commission, which is basically the written job offer. You know, if someone offers you a job, over the phone or whatever, great, but you don't have anything official till you have something in writing. Well, the same with these positions. In the mad rush to get all this done before the Jefferson administration took over, they didn't get them all done. Like literally, some of these commissions that were supposed to go out to these nominees who had been approved for federal judgeships, some of these commissions were still sitting on the desk in the office when Thomas Jefferson walked in on his first day of president after being inaugurated. One of those that did not get delivered, one of these commissions for a new position in the federal judiciary, was intended for a guy named John Marbury. And it was, so I'll just stop there and go in here. Jefferson takes office, and he's well aware of what just happened, of this plan, and he's angry, and he's rightfully angry. The issue that decided the election was the role of the courts in American government, and Jefferson won. So the people spoke, such as it was, given that the people at that time were white male property owners, but we'll come back to that later. Jefferson won the election on the basis of campaigning for less powerful courts and more power retained to state governments and state elected officials. So it was not very cool what this plan was that outgoing President John Adams and John Marshall carried out. It was really sort of against the will of the election, if you want to think of it that way. So he refuses to deliver the remaining commissions, the ones that were left on the desk. He says, I'm not going to deliver those. Why would he? Why would he help carry out the plan that was basically subverting his election? Marbury, the guy who was supposed to get the commission and therefore the job, he was angry too because he wanted the job. And why wouldn't you? It's a cushy federal judgeship. So Marbury sued. He went to the Supreme Court to seek a writ of mandamus. Remember what that was? Let me go back up here. Marbury invoked this clause in the Judiciary Act of 1789 that says the Supreme Court can issue a writ of mandamus. Marbury went to the Supreme Court saying, this law of Congress says that you have the power to issue an order directing someone to do something. The order I want you to issue is I want you to tell Thomas Jefferson to issue me my commission. So I hope that makes sense. The guy who didn't get the job because he didn't get the paperwork invoked the Judiciary Act of 1789, the part about the writ of mandamus, and he went to the Supreme Court and said, I want you, Supreme Court, to issue a writ, issue an order to Thomas Jefferson, forcing him to give me my paperwork so I can have my job. This case now comes before John Marshall, the Secretary of State to John Adams, who had helped create this mess by not getting all the paperwork delivered. He was Secretary of State, now he's Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now the mess is in his lap, and he was largely responsible for the mess by not getting all the paperwork delivered. So you might think that as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he's now in a position to rectify this. He can simply side with Marbury and say, yes, you're right, I will order Thomas Jefferson to issue that writ. Well, it's not so simple. It's not so simple because if he did issue that order, if he sided with Marbury and said, Jefferson, issue the paperwork to Marbury, Jefferson would have ignored it. The Supreme Court has zero enforcement power. The Supreme Court can issue orders, and those orders are valid to the extent that the recipients of them believe the court has the authority, the legitimacy to give them. And Jefferson would have loved to ignore an order of the court. He would have loved nothing better than to be put in a position to ignore an order of the court, because his whole goal was to weaken the power of the courts. So if John Marshall had decided that way, that's what would have happened. But if he decides against Marbury and doesn't issue the writ, then it looks like he's backing down from a fight with Jefferson, which again weakens the perception of the court is that it's weakened. So it seems like either way, Marshall loses. Whichever way he decides to go, whether he he agrees with Marbury and issues the writ only to have it ignored, or whether he decides against Marbury, doesn't issue the writ, and then looks like he's backing down from Jefferson from a fight, either way, What he wants, a stronger court, doesn't happen. And what he gets is a weaker court, and Marshall, remember, was a federalist. He wanted a stronger federal court system. So it seems like he's in a no-win situation, which is where his brilliance comes in. He issued a two-part decision. Part one was a strong rebuke to Jefferson, telling him that basically Marbury had been duly appointed to an existing judicial position. He had been confirmed by the Senate. It was simply a paperwork snafu that prevented his getting the position, and Jefferson should issue the paperwork, and so he rebuked Jefferson. But, and this is the more important part, Marshall said the court cannot issue the writ because the writ itself is unconstitutional. The legal basis for the writ of mandamus is unconstitutional. The part in the Judiciary Act of 1789, the law that says that gave the Supreme Court the power to issue that writ, that is unconstitutional. And here's why. The legal basis for the writ, the part of the Judiciary Act of 1789 that says, where Congress says the Supreme Court may issue writs, but issuing a writ involves going directly to the Supreme Court. You remember I said that Marbury went to the Supreme Court to ask them to issue this writ to force Jefferson to issue the command. So Marbury went directly to the Supreme Court with this request. But going directly to the Supreme Court is tantamount to the Supreme Court exercising original jurisdiction. You hopefully see where this is going. The Supreme Court has original jurisdiction in two instances only: disputes between states and disputes involving foreign ministers. This is neither one of those. The Constitution was very clear on when the Supreme Court can exercise original jurisdiction during those two types of disputes, foreign ministers and states. Seeking a writ of mandamus is neither one of those. So basically what Marshall did was strike down that clause, that section of this Judiciary Act of 1789, saying it violates the Constitution. This law that Congress passed in 1789 contains a section that goes against what the Constitution says. That section says that people can go to the Supreme Court to seek a writ of mandamus, but the Constitution says there's only two instances where you can go to the Supreme Court, and this isn't either one of those. This is hugely important because what Marshall did basically in taking that section of the law that Congress passed, the Judiciary Act, and striking it down, that is exercising judicial review. The power of judicial review, which is the fundamental power that the courts have, that's the power to review the actions or the decisions of other branches of government, the executive or the legislative, and to strike those down if the court believes those are unconstitutional. That is the power of the court. And in this case, in Marbury versus Madison, John Marshall exercised that power for the very first time. The brilliance of his decision is that he seemed to be in a no-win spot, between a rock and a hard place. He either issues an order that Jefferson will ignore, or he backs down from Jefferson. Either option seems to weaken the courts. What he did in exercising judicial review was he increased the power of the courts. He exercised a power that they had not previously had, and it wasn't altogether clear that that's what the founders had in mind. It's pretty clear that's what the Federalists had in mind for the courts, but not at all clear what everyone else had in mind. But he took it, he exercised it, and he did so in a way that left Jefferson with no meaningful response, no comeback, basically. He just exercised the power. This established the power of judicial review for the courts for the first time, and they've exercised it ever since. And this is where we get to, really, the question that I opened the discussion with. The actions of elected officials, our Congress, our president, those actions are voided by unelected judges through the exercise of the power of judicial review. And when they do this, they are essentially having the final say. This is essentially the last word on this subject. Now you might say, well, okay, if something's unconstitutional, but we want it to be constitutional, then why don't we just amend the Constitution? I mean, there's a process. There's two processes for doing that. They're in the Constitution. Well, yeah, sure, but it's really hard to do. Amending the Constitution requires supermajorities in the House and the Senate in favor of something, and then the approval of supermajorities among the states. That's very hard to do. There's a reason why our Constitution has been amended basically 17 times in over 250 years. And that's because, so you might say, actually, aren't there 27 amendments? Yes, but the first 10, the Bill of Rights, were sort of automatically added on. After the Bill of Rights, we've had exactly 17 amendments, and that's it, to the Constitution, in the entire history of our country. So it's so hard to amend the Constitution that when the judges rule something unconstitutional, that is essentially the final word, the last say on that question. Okay, so that is how the courts acquired the power that they have. And we're about halfway through the slides that I have for this section. So I'm going to quit here, take a break. And when we come back, we'll get into how the courts have exercised that power in terms of the 3 eras of judicial review. And we'll talk a lot about the modern exercise of the power of judicial review.